What's very difficult about doing this is, of course, that the last two provocations happen immediately before you have to sum them up. So, and they are actually very fresh in your mind, so you probably don't need that much summing up, although I think I ought to refer back to them, albeit in kind of chronological order. So, the text. It is very tempting to begin with the octopus in the suitcase that Dan Richards mentioned at the end of our very first provocation by Chris Bigsby. It is, after all, a creature with 8 limbs, and we have had 8 quite various tentacular provocations. Lucy Hughes Hallett's biography of Gabriele D'Annunzio, about whom she spoke that morning, is titled The Pike. John Cook then spoke of D'Annunzio being drawn to his public as a predatory bird to its prey. Kyoko Yoshida, in her reading, told us a story about squirrels with secret gardens. Liz Berry read us 2 poems featuring birds, one of which, she told us, was a certain kind of pigeon, known in the Black Country, that's the Midlands, as a Birmingham roller, which I first misheard as a burning umbrella. Anna Funder, I liked it very much. Anna Funder gave us, I hope it was Anna, she can correct me later. Was it Ernst Toller who was the animal with a beaked bird with a glossy black head? Kind of, okay. Then Vesna suggested that hoping to be a writer by engaging in literary study was like preparing to be a jockey by qualifying as a vet. So I was rather hoping that I might be able to link all the sessions together by reference to various animals, but then the animals thinned out and grew somehow facetious. And the only analogy I have left in my hand is the analogy of the menagerie, which stands. It would be equally tempting, actually, to begin with As You Like It, which I'm surprised nobody actually quoted, and Jakes's All the World's a Stage speech, seeing as we're talking about reputation, about the 7 ages of man, where the 4th age belongs to a soldier who is conveniently actually compared to a leopard, full of strange oaths and bearded like a pard, jealous in honour, sudden and quick in quarrels, seeking the bubble reputation even in the cannon's mouth. And that, I thought, might cover a few bases in thinking of reputation in terms of honour and of quarrels, of the sheer transience of bubbles, and indeed of cannons, both a firing kind with 2 ends and a kind perhaps just as deadly in its own way with just one. John Cook built his introduction to the salons on Pascal Casanova's book, The World of Letters, and set about exploring the idea of place as reputation. Where do you go to make your reputation? Well, to the big cities, of course, to Paris, to London, to Berlin, to New York, to the great metropolis beyond your own backyard. Metropolitan power, he said, following Casanova, was a matter of accumulation, of competition, rivalry, and dispute, like those jealousies in Jakes's honor speech, and of concentration, a kind of density where all the books and ideas are crowded and jostling together. He also brought our attention to the idea of a national literary consciousness, which some posit as the glory or even definition of a nation, while pointing out exceptions, John pointing them out, such as Stendhal, who notoriously, to his French countrymen, preferred Shakespeare to Racine. But wherever it's happening now, he ended, it will probably go on to happen elsewhere. I suspect this ease and rapidity of movement has a great deal to do with the technology of immediate communication and the globalization of capital. In any case, as Feste, another melancholy clown in Shakespeare, points out, the whirligig of time brings in his revengers. So that was very much the subject of our first provocation by Chris Bigsby, who started by exploring and expanding on the term reputation by adding estimation and notoriety to which others were eventually added, such as fame, success, prestige, stature, esteem, position, distinction, prominence. There were at least 8 tentacles for our octopus here. Chris went on to consider those whom we now regard as great, but who were neglected at the end of their lives: Herman Melville, Angus Wilson, John Williams, who wrote Stoner among them. but concentrating on a writer he himself has written about with such distinction, Arthur Miller, the estimation of whose work has gone up and down depending on when you were and where you were in the US and in Britain. Was Miller accepted by Americans as a representative of all they considered best? No. Was he regarded by Brits as what we thought a good liberal American should be? Probably yes. But who is this we? Are we here the only we worth talking about? That question did arise afterwards, as did the notions of value, a much more complex term, depending on who assigns it. And Erica Yarns' fine distinction between success and reputation. Is selling more books an indication of reputation or indeed of value? Amit Chowdhury talked of the way reputation was constructed in terms of nationhood, but also how some were required to run counter to that narrative. How do revivals of reputation occur, asked Cathy Cole. Jack Wang pointed out that despite not being regarded as a true blue or red-blooded American, Miller actually was still on school reading lists. Susan Barker lamented the lack of women amongst those considered important, importance being another related term. A problem pointed out in private discussion later by Dave Wilson, who remarked that all the names discussed at that particular session were white, male and Anglophone. Anna Funder did, on the other hand, confirm the substantial reputation and stature of the Australian writer Christina Stead. She talked of the importance of history and wondered how far literature was perceived as an aspect of history, or vice versa, for that matter. Deborah Smith brought us back to the question of women's writing, and height was evaluated according to different criteria in different places. In the West along feminist lines, but differently elsewhere with other histories and other cultures, and later on Catholicism and Buddhism were offered as examples in later sessions. Reputation might simply be a kind of noise, a form of agreement, she said. It might in fact be constraining if it meant publishers would demand simply more of the same from any successful author. Lucy Hughes Hallett's provocation on Denuncio was spellbinding and very much to the point, since her subject not only pursued reputation, but understood perfectly how to get it. He was a genius of the publicity stunt, a polymath, brilliant at many things, including poetry, seduction, and rebel-rousing rhetoric. Reputation is not a sufficiently grand term for him. Celebrity, superstar, megastar need to be introduced. He arrives in the first age of mass media. He steps on people, he corrals people, he charms and discards people. He leads them into battle, into a fierce nationalism, anticipating Il Duce, whom he regards as vulgar. There was a lovely phrase Lucy used about Denuncio, giving, I think I'm quoting right, action the lasting power of symbol. And maybe that is what it takes. Dan then added another word to the vocabulary of reputation by referring to Denuncios as a brand. Branding and mass media are very much of our age, but they begin with Denuncio. The poet as life, as mask, as symbol. In a discussion afterwards, Vesna talked of the art of life-making. Others talked of the way suicide fixes the author as identity, as purpose or fate or destiny. Stefan Zweig was mentioned as an example of fame arrested and amplified by suicide. Mishima was another such. And then John Cook suggested that Allen Ginsberg's public life was an extension of his poems, and again, possibly vice versa. Lucy pointed to the line from Romanticism to fascism. Amit mentioned Tagore, who became a world celebrity as sage and purveyor of mysticism rather than what he was back in India, a poet. Chris Bixby pointed to Mailer and Hemingway as conscious purveyors of their own images. Consideration of the image and the self-image led us in the direction of social media. At one level, inflation of the self appears comical. At another, venal and potentially disastrous. On Wednesday morning, the attention turned, as it often does, to creative writing and its place at university. This at first may not seem to relate directly to reputation, but there are ways of linking it in. John Cook quoted Malcolm Bradbury on the unlikelihood of transforming small talent to big talent, but the hope of establishing a significant climate within which writing in general might prosper. David Taylor, led the attack via Cyril Connolly's 1938 book, Enemies of Promise. Connolly, what David called romantic classicist, sensualist and anti-academic, was partly critical, offered a partly critical perspective, partly a personal memoir. But the central part of the book used the image of various weeds to describe factors militating against great literature and the writing life proper. These included hack work, political commitment, escapism, the pressure of promise, sex, domesticity, the famous pram in a hall, and last, and possibly worst of all, well, it didn't say so, success itself. David invented a family in which an earlier generation wrote neglected books but survived by hack work, and a later one which proceeded from a creative writing degree to book publication, then back into university. A racket, as he called it, where academics write for each other and lose contact with the greater public. He preferred the earlier generation, if only because they did things in the real world, whereas the academic world was not real. Instead of asking questions at this stage, John Morley, who was in the chair, asked Vesna to respond with her own provocation, and she talked of her early youth, of writing poetry, and of her parents' determination that she should be a doctor, something a lot of us have in common here. But she studied comparative literature instead, where she said she wrote less and less as the course went on. Studying literature as a subject of criticism did not make one a writer. In other words, vets don't make jockeys. She referred to Hanif Qureshi's contemptuous dismissal of creative writing while teaching it. There were the natural comparisons with other art subjects, such as music and visual art, where no one thought to question the idea of formal institutional education. Was creative writing a vocational course that fitted you to the life of a wage-earning writer, writing life proper, as David might have put it? Would it help you to succeed or to gain a reputation, or was it something else? Is the respectability of fine academic opinion, and this is where it bears upon the idea of reputation, is the respectability of fine academic opinion one of the underwriters of reputation? Vesna herself did not make too high a claim for institutions and shared a certain awareness of them. Geir Gulliksen suggested that the best a creative writing course could do was to create good readers, and added that working in publishing is also a kind of institution. John T. Driver said he had heard that the Norwegian state buys 1,000 copies of all literary books. I certainly sat up when I heard that. True, said Geir, true. The state does intervene to save the literature that it recognizes as literature. Jack Wang has long experience of teaching creative writing and referred to an essay by Chad Harback comparing the MFA culture, the creative writing culture of universities, with the NYC culture, that is the writing in the world of publishers. Neither, he suggested, was free of limiting considerations, but at least the university allowed for experiment and the avant-garde. Anna Clavel talked of the problem of commercialization in Mexico, Manta of the tension between comparative lit and straight literature departments. James Shea remarked that there were in fact ancient schools of haiku, so creative writing wasn't quite such a new thing, and that creative writing was expanding in China and now in Singapore too. Anna van der wondered how teaching might affect one's writing, while Erica said publishers don't really like creative writing. Mind you, I think if they really didn't, they wouldn't be publishing them. Lauren commented that institutions bestowed a kind of respectability in the eyes of the outside world, for example, her parents. Kyoko had done an MFA course and returned to Japan to find that people back home had no idea what that meant. She did, however, emphasize an important thing, that in creative writing there was an ethical contract that agreed your writing and desire to write were legitimate and would be taken seriously. I suggested that not only had writers always met informally, but it was partly a matter of luck if you happened to come across those willing to discuss your work with you in person. I also suggested teaching writing was essentially a matter of intelligent conversation. Dan agreed, but pointed out the high cost of such courses and such conversations. Lucy, wondered why creative writing should not be regarded as a form of education in itself, a kind of vocational training with adaptable skills. You did not necessarily have to become a writer. Thinking and reading were the important things. And indeed, it's true that a good arts degree can train a mind to handle tasks well outside its original remit. Amit pointed out that creative writing classes were the only ones where no one ever bunked off. Students wanted every minute they could get. He also noted, by the way, a certain tension between literary theory and reading for literary style. Deborah Smith agreed with Kyoko and imagined creative writing must be a great deal better than straight English literature, which for her was a matter of ploughing through work by a lot of dead white men. Romas Kinka worried about the lack of support and respect for translators. Jack said it was a matter of earning a living. All writers had to do it one way or the other, and modern pedagogic practice was far from the kind of racket David Taylor had called it. It was in fact a profession with high professional standards. Bhavit Mehta surprised us by arguing that there wasn't in fact a shrinking readership, that readership was wider than ever. It was just that readers weren't all reading necessarily in hard copy book form. David Taylor ended on a different note, which is also, I think, a very interesting one, that of a necessary solitude. He lamented its loss in a climate of workshops, social media, and public forums, and I thought that was a very interesting and valid point. There was after this a departure, which I will say something about, the 2-hour session on translation, in which 3 authors appeared with their translators. The authors read a sentence or two in the original language, then the translators read longer passages in translation. Each author was then invited to ask their translator 3 questions. This session was led by Erika. The 3 writers, Georg Gulliksen, Han Kang, and Szirtes Parulskis, write in quite different ways about quite different things. The translators were asked the normal but vital translation questions, and each answered differently. Deborah Smith, the translator of Han Kang, argued that the translator should feed the text through the bloodstream. In other words, to feel it in oneself by accessing, in some ways, the experience described. Deborah, who just had 1 week to translate a longish passage out of I've lost my place. Of Gehr's book about gender and sexuality, was arguing that it was the original text one should go back to time after time. Translation, she said, this was interesting too, was like acting, which is a fascinating and unexplored idea, but well worth exploring. Romas insisted that the translator should know the full cultural and historical context, be utterly at home in both languages, and that translators never improved original texts. Or if the text had mistakes, that should be left to the copy editors to sort out. This actually concurs, I think, with Nabokov's view of translators as mischievous and incompetent servants always messing around with the text, who think they know better. And I think probably working with Max Sable might have been a little bit like that too at times. In the salon on Thursday, Manta and Szirtes gave the provocations. Manta talked of India with its many languages, of which her own Kannada is one. One may make a name for oneself, a reputation, in one language, alone, but that name may be extended in translation into into Indian language. Being translated into or writing in English made one available to an international public and offered the chance of an international reputation. However, there were many complications, such as religion, caste, and gender. Reputation, she argued, was rooted in imagined memory, a memory that was exclusive and omitted anything it didn't want to admit, particularly the writing of women and the Dalit, the untouchables. Social and gender roles were defined by ideals derived from sacred or mythological texts, for example, the Ramayana. Male roles were defined by Rama, female as understood by Shiva. If individuals departed... Okay, thank you. I will make the changes. If individuals departed from these models, their reputations would be ruined. The current government of India, led by Modi, emphasized the martial aspect of Rama and looked to very conservative interpretations of the Ramayana. The women's movement had brought progress, but the major roles were still all male. Bavit argued this, by the way, that it was not the case. Now he was saying that all the major festivals had equal numbers of men and women, as well as Dalit writers, and I can't intervene in that because I have no idea. Afterwards, there were questions about women-only publishers. Manta didn't like the idea of a special spot for women poets, feeling that this meant that they were expected to produce women's poetry and be like the flowers at a reception. Indian writing should not be looking to package particular groups in specific ways, but focus on diversity. India was, after all, as she said earlier, a secular democratic nation. There was talk of the tension between Hindu and Muslim. Manta mentioned but did not expand on the episode of the Kodra train blaze. Marian argued that the increasing popularity of the ghazal verse form in Urdu was evidence of an essential anti-fundamentalism. John Morley wondered how far writing was a form of resistance, and whether there were examples of a writer forging one reputation and then forging a different one. In fact, I can think of examples. There's a Singaporean poet called Yi Shang, who wrote a book which won major literary prize, and then abandoned it. He was gay, he became a slam poet, and he was dedicated himself to performance. He's made that sort of reputation now. Actually, we can even think of people like Clive James, who've kind of shifted between various status. Szirtes's Provocation was read by his translator, Romas, and it has links with Elif's paper. It was a story behind his current book, which is about the murder of Lithuanian Jews, as much by Lithuanians as by German Nazis. It was in the Imperial War Museum in London that he discovered that in his own small home community of just over 2,000 people, over 1,000 Jews were executed, but that no one chose to remember this, partly because years of Soviet occupation had implanted the idea it was the Germans alone who'd done the bad things, and and it was not so much even the Jews as communists that they had been killing. This became what he called shameful knowledge. Now, the subject is well covered in the West, but was never mentioned in Lithuania, and not even his mother, who had lived through it, believed it. He resisted the idea that literature should be ideologically committed, not surprising in view of years of ideologically committed or controlled literature in Eastern Europe. There was no repentance in Lithuanian society, he said, only denial. How much time, he asked, did it take for a corpse to become a historical corpse? We are, he said, parasites living on the corpses of the past. Lithuanians had certainly suffered, he said, but suffering can make you more cruel, not necessarily more humane. There was a constant referring back to Christian belief in both Szirtes's novel and in his Provocation. Religion, he said, was a form of resistance to the Soviets, and it is deeply embedded in Lithuanian people. James asked, I think, whether the book was unusual for Szirtes. Szirtes's answers were partly answers to what was asked and partly answers to things that should very well have been asked, which was, it was important to irritate yourself, he said. Without irritation, there is no literature. Erica wondered whether it was odd that he was writing something that questioned the narrative of the Lithuanian nation while being promoted by the Lithuanian state. The state was not the same as the cultural wing, argued Rita Valiukonita, the cultural attaché at the Lithuanian embassy in London, who was with us. Was the opposite view, the guiltless version expressed in Lithuanian literature, asked Dan. There is an anti-Semitic spirit in Lithuania, said Szirtes, but it is not overt in literature. Jack Wang spoke about his own book, how it had come about the same question from a different angle. That's to say, it was not shame, it was a certain kind of pride in having rescued Jews from death. What, asked Deborah Dawkin, is the effect of knowing that once a book like this is translated, the nation's secret is out, the dirty linen is there for examination. I might have said that it's not really a secret outside of Lithuania so much. I mean, we are not necessarily ignorant in the West of what happened. But the interesting thing is what happens when we know that the same secret is being unveiled in the place of its origin. So it's a complex idea. So what happens? Szirtes replied that basically gets panned for it. Kyoko made a very, very, I think, interesting remark at the end. She said, we like to take the side of the victim, but that makes it very hard for us to imagine ourselves as violators, as perpetrators. And went on to ask whether the obscenity referred to by Szirtes in his provocation was the act itself, the killings, or the describing of it. It was the describing, said Szirtes, but it had to be done for didactic reasons. What is it we identify with in the story of atrocities elsewhere? There are many books, almost too many, some say, about the Holocaust in the West, and one of the charges laid against Szirtes in Lithuania, as I said, was that he'd become of what I think was Norman Finkelstein's term, the Holocaust industry. In the case of Szirtes in Lithuania, we were moved to hear that the truth could be spoken in a place where there was concealment. But perhaps what it inspires us to do is to tell truths about our own circumstances rather than to feel too comfortable about our sympathies for the victims. His take on reputation was therefore the reputation of his society, of Lithuania, not so much in the outside world, but in fact at home as perceived in the outside world. Reputation, in effect, was a lie. In Mamta's case, reputation was a social status you could lose, a repressive force. Was creative writing about the power of partially closed societies, such as universities, but also publishers perhaps, was that power the power to make reputations? And if that they had that power, was it a power that flattered their own preferences and extended their own power? Elif and David's, I won't say very much about. You can see how Elif's works in together with Szirtes, because they're both politically engaged and they're suggesting political engagement. Whether this political engagement is direct or whether it takes place in other contexts, is it possible, if in fact all acts are political, is it possible, for example, that a perfectly domestic novel could be read within a political framework? How active should we be? How far should we combine together for this or that reason? How far should we present ourselves as the proponents of a particular case? How far should we be joining? How far is it our responsibility? One of the difficulties I suspect in the West is we can say almost anything we like, and it doesn't matter very much. We can write about this or that disgraceful thing, maybe some less, maybe some more, and that we stand very little risk. We don't do it at risk, and that makes it very, very hard for us. There used to be a time in the 80s when I think people almost used to envy Eastern European writers because they'd gained a certain moral authority by facing risk. The one thing which you did say, which was interesting, which is we cannot afford the luxury of non-participation, which may be true, but it did vaguely remind me of its mirror opposite, which is something which I learned while I was in Singapore. What Lee Kuan Yew said, we cannot afford the luxury of poetry. So there are always luxuries you can't afford, and you try to see what it is that makes you not able to afford them. I just as a little matter, just addressing something that Dan said about the short stories. There's a very interesting long article in the New Yorker, I think 3 or 4 weeks ago, about the poetry of ISIS. And it is romantic poetry, it is literary poetry, it draws greatly upon the Quran, and poetry is actually almost more of an inspiration to them. They sing it than the very simple stories. So, and then we had David. Well, again, I don't need to summarize David's very much. I think it must take it as a pretty accurate description of where we are, as to what it leaves us to do, what it leaves us to write, what it leaves us to consider when we are writing. Essentially, we are not altogether an endangered species yet. And we may not be, because in fact his final summing up was fairly optimistic in terms of micro-publishing, in terms of the possibility of actually spreading literatures so they don't become entirely parochial through the internet, through other places. You can read text from anywhere. A couple of very interesting publications were mentioned, the publishers like Perene, Music and Literature, which actually uses writers, some of the best known writers appear in this. They don't get paid, or they get paid very, very little, but they think it's a good thing to do, and that is something we ourselves can do. So, when is a Birmingham roller a burning umbrella? Was the octopus back in its suitcase? What is the proliferation of synonyms of reputation? Fame, respect, recognition, success, prestige, stature, esteem, position, distinction, prominence, celebrity, stardom, importance, influence, brand. Tell us. And what of value? What is it? How do we know it? How develop it? Achieve it? How do we arrive at the idea of it? Who are the we who arrive there or assess its possible arrival and achievement? How far can we be sure of ourselves? On what grounds? How far can we persuade others, and on what grounds? Are there common human qualities we can call on in respect of which we may assume common human consent? Does it matter that we should? And what happens when we assume that we shouldn't? I'll finish up with 6 tiny little texts, if you don't mind. I did this last year, and it's a kind of goes back into my own kind of territory of poetry, or very, very short text. And this won't take a second. Well, it will take a few seconds. Okay, these are semi-nonsense, semi-surreal little texts, what else to call them. Man was tying his tongue into knots. It's so I don't forget to say the right thing, he said, or tried to. A little Cyrano might help us all. Part nose, part poetry, part swordsmanship. Okay, forget the swordsmanship. Forget the poetry. Keep the nose. The grand rhetorical sweep, the oracular gesture, the big words putting their shoulders to the door, the bouncers letting them in. A big hall crowded with people. A word creeps in on all fours and works its way through all the feet, stands up, but can't speak. If I say it, it will appear. If I add a word, it'll do as I say. If I add an adverb, it'll act in the best possible way. So it goes. Lastly, the octopus in a suitcase meets the squirrel in the secret garden. It is a day like any other. Now let's unpack the suitcase. Thank you.